Welcome back, nerds. Fino here. You guys planning to roll for the GSSR? Well, I got some tips for you. This time around, we got kind of a weird division. You've got all the limited servants with the males corralled into a trio of banners, while the females are split among 6. These are a hodgepodge based on whether they're knight, 4 horsemen, or extra class servants. Now, some of these banners have extremely high risk, so to account for this, I've given each servant a ballpark rating and I'm averaging these to value each banner. Now, I really don't like giving number ratings to servants, and I'm definitely not going to show you them, because it's going to derail into an argument about why Abigail's in the doghouse, and that's not the point. So my assumptions are that you're going from NP1 to 0, so if you have some of these servants already, you'll have to make a judgment call on whether it's worth it for you. So with that said, here are all the GSSR banners for New Year's 2023 on NA, rated from worst to best. Number 9. Red Cavalry 2. Starting at the bottom is Red Cavalry 2, which is kind of a shock to me, because it has both Scotty and Rhaenys. Now, Scotty's not exactly a spring chicken at this point, but she is a meta quick enabler. And while she isn't as much of a grand slam as someone like Astoria, a meta card type enabler is still extremely valuable. Then there's Rhaenys, which is also quite good. I see her as waiver with more of a defensive slant, but while she's usually off meta, she's highly useful as a backup charger for use with sketchy nodes or less consistent loopers. And if you're big into the Gogh system, she is quite a get. Then we have Mysterious Heroine Exalter, who's a single-target berserker that does crazy damage against sabers and good-aligned servants. She's a generalist beatstick, so if you win the lottery and somehow double SSR her and Scotty off this banner, you're in outstanding shape. Then there's Raiko, which breaks my heart, but she's non-fish compatible, she's got a lot of competition. But that said, she can both make and use her own stars, which count for something, especially if you have a newer account. She does it reasonably hard. Then there's Summer Nero, who is technically Vich compatible, but even with her attack buffs, she has some serious damage issues. So it's hard for me to give her like a high assessment. Then there's Shuten Doji, which despite her massive attack stat, she's not really well equipped to exploit it. With a bunch of debuffs and, a one-hit Arts Noble Phantasm, just a real tragedy all around. There's Da Vinci Caster, who has a 50% battery and anti-defensive abilities, but her atrocious NP hit count, much like Shuten Doji, doesn't do her any favors. She really struggles to maintain pressure, so she's kind of a bad get. Then there's Maid Alter, who is a wishy-washy attacker and far too restrictive for her own good. I'm really not a fan. And rounding out the very bottom of the worst banner, and a pretty big reason why it's the worst banner, is Cleopatra, who is an extremely outdated AoE assassin and just generally kind of bad all around. Like, people just kind of put up with her when she came out because, high rarity AoE assassins were something of a novelty back then. But nowadays, bad. Just straight up bad. Number 8. White Extra. Barely edging out the previous banner is White Extra, which isn't nearly as flashy, but the low end on this isn't quite as extreme, shall we say, because the previous banner had like a lot of really terrible servants. Well, mediocre servants, but you know what I mean. But as for this banner, you lead off with Sherlock, who has the ability to give your team both defense bypass and invuln pierce. That's quite enticing, although for my purposes, I like him the most in fights where an enemy's going to come back with an NP and blow him off the field. He's a notable esports servant, and with his second skill upgrade, he won't even need K-Scope to fill this role, so, good stuff. Then there's Doman, a supportive attacker for Chaotic Evil teams, and he can farm as well if he needs to. I recently did a guide on Doman, so I won't go over the whole spiel here, but suffice to say he's solid. Then there's Shi Huangdi. People seem a bit down on Mothman Lelouch nowadays, but I think that once Mighty Chains become a thing, he'll become a lot better at cycling his NP. Currently though, he wants to face card a lot, but he's also very needy in terms of resources, so that's a mark against him. Next up is Edmund Dantes. With Space Ishtar in the picture, my boy Edmund has fallen a bit by the wayside, but eventually he'll get a buff that gives him a battery and let him purge buffs when he crits. This combined with his invuln pierce means you can still do some fun stuff with him. Oh, poor Voyager. I'm gonna be real with you, one Voyager isn't gonna do much for your account, and unless you already have some, pulling him from this banner is going to be a bit of a disaster. Dead last on this banner is Amakusa Shiro. He preemptively purges buffs on his Noble Phantasm, and at one point this actually counted for something. Aside from this, he works a bit like an offensive ruler Jean, which means he's basic, but he can't even keep you alive. Nowadays, he's just terrible, straight up. Number 7. White Knights. Its big selling point is Super Orion, who's a crit archer. He really carries this banner. His crits will send enemies to Kingdom Come, and he can even cheese some of the unwinnable fights against enemies with massive health bars, including one that's actually coming up in Little Big Tengu later this month. And he does most of what you'd want from him, even at NP1. Then there's Gilgamesh, who does big damage. It's actually so high that Gilgamesh actually enters the lower half of the single target bracket as an AoE, which is pretty impressive. And this is pure speculation, but if you ask me, he's a likely target for future buffs even on JP. Aside from that, he's got the crit stick going. He's solid, if a bit old school. Next up is Romulus Quirinus. He's a beatstick with a weird roam buff debuff mechanic that determines his NP damage. He hits hard but has little in the way of utility. His battery is also too low to be Vich compatible. Someone who does work with Vich is Moriarty, although you wouldn't know it. Although you wouldn't think it, he's a supportive attacker. Unfortunately, he doesn't really commit to one card type, having an arch deck and a buster NP, but he does have that 50% battery. That counts for something. But I do wish Free Shooter lasted a bit longer, or his evil debuff doubled up on himself. As it stands, he can hit kinda hard, but he's a bit unreliable for my taste. Oh wait, he's right servant, never mind, 10 out of 10. Then we have Sigurd, who I wanted to give a higher rating since he's a crit stick servant, but he's saddled with a bunch of hit-based buffs, which hurt his upper end performance. Saber Astolfo is a bit of an odd duck. He has a weird kit, loaded on paper but with weird drawbacks like him having Buster Star Absorption despite being a quick servant. This becomes less of an issue once Ruler Scotty comes out, but as it stands he's just alright. A self-contained skill set and not much else. Then comes Arthur. His buffs make him an okay crit stick in isolation, so I'm not gonna shit talk him too hard. He's pretty mediocre though. Number 6. Red Extra 2. This one starts strong with Van Gogh, who's a powerful soloist and duelist with another copy of herself. A very strange servant, but she can do some crazy stun lock clears. After Van Gogh though, we drop pretty hard in the power scale with Alter Ego Kiara, who has amazing utility, but she has anemic damage for an attacker. At NP1 especially, you're gonna have some pretty serious trouble actually killing stuff with her. Then we have Jeanne Alter, a crit stick with a buff block. She has a crit kit, which means she works decently even at low NP levels, so she's alright. Moon Cancer Kiara is an arts attacker that needs like a 500 IQ to use. She's solid, but much like her alter ego self, she struggles at NP1. Okita Alter is an AoE alter ego. Not nearly as essential as a single target alter ego, but she has some ability to beat people up with her face cards, so that's okay. Vanilla Hokusai is an AoE arts foreigner with buff removal resistance. She has her uses in some tricky multi-enemy fights. Demon King Nobunaga is a beatstick avenger with an AoE NP and no star absorption, which kinda sucks. She's got some interesting utility for herself, but she's a pretty jank servant overall. The one that I have trouble recommending. It's actually not all that bad of a banner, but here to tank its rating is Ruler Artoria. Bunny Toria is bad. Well, let me put it this way. She has one really nice skill in the form of a card shuffle with a crit buff. With its upgrade, you can even lock a support out of the card pool to get more for your main attacker. But the drawback is that you have to run Bunny Toria on your front line to do this. And for her part, she has a kit of a terrible attacker. Like, anemic doesn't even begin to describe what she does in combat. It's so bad that you'd rather lose the shuffle and run real supports, or even Summer BB to take better advantage of the good hands that do show up. This banner ended up with the same average as White Knights, but I gave it an edge since more of these servants scale better with NP levels, meaning there's room to grow. Number 5. White Cavalry. Leading off with Merlin. Buster is currently off meta, and consequently so is Merlin, but the fact that he has meter and heal per turn buffs on his NP means you can utilize him in the Immortal team to give sustain. Lady Avalon eventually overtakes him in this application on account of her arts-oriented kit, but Merlin does it fine as things currently stand. And let's not forget he's a key Buster crit enabler and lets some servants hit comically high damage numbers. Then there's Arjuna Alter. Despite Morgan coming to usurp his place, Arjuna is an absolute juggernaut in the damage department, and he's nothing to sneeze at. Next comes First Hassan. Funny enough, despite initially looking like kind of an antiquated soloist, Gramps is actually due for a huge indirect buff in the form of the Mighty Chain Mechanics change. That lets him be far more sufficient in a solo deployment. He might not be as sexy as Kama, but First Hassan has aged surprisingly well. Next up is Kintoki, who's a Buster beatstick with a massive battery. He works well with Vich, but his buffs are a bit on the crap side. A big jump downwards is Ivan. By and large, Elephant Man is just okay. His big selling point is his on-demand AoE buff purge. Otherwise, he's a beatstick and not much else. Sliding down further is Hijikata. This guy leans way too hard on the low health enmity thing, and his buffs are just too fundamentally weak to justify the trouble of giving him stars and keeping him alive. And that's despite the guts. At rock bottom on this banner is Iskandar. He's a thoroughly outdated attacker that demands external charge and stars, but he barely gives you anything back for it. He's the worst possible result here, and if you get lured in by Merlin's Siren Song, just remember this guy could be in your future. Number 4. Red Knights 2. The highest end result of this banner isn't quite as impressive as some of the previous ones, since it's Nero Bride. She's an off-meta loop supporter, but if you get her and you don't already have other looping options, you can opt into some of the older arrangements. She's not nearly as great for established accounts, but if you're a new player, it's a pretty decent result. Then we have Jeanne Archer. Looping arts archers are invaluable, and Jeanne is among the best. The only worry is her NP1 damage. Then comes Musashi Saber. With her buffs, she becomes a more persistent threat and less of a one-turn wonder. Her anti-alter ego and moon cancer niche is a bit weird, but potentially usable. The mix of very high damage and decent utility gives her a high score in my book. After that, we have Benny Enma. She's solid, but as an art saber, she's unfortunately competing with Hoku Saber, and below NP3, it's hard for me to justify taking the Sparrow over the Octopus. Tama Lancer is a hard servant to rate. On one hand, she got a buff, so she doesn't cripple herself anymore, and that particular skill gives you a lot of nice effects. But the rest of her kit is a bit on the basic side, though speeding up an enemy's NP actually does have useful applications once in a while. But I guess you can leverage her as a crit beatstick even at NP1, and that counts for something. Skak is a bit of a one-pump chump herself, but she can put out some pretty impressive damage numbers. The booby prize this time around is Sei Shonagon, who's a clunky AoE archer. She desperately needs upgrades. This banner actually ended up with the same score as the white cavalry banner, and the reason for that is that even though the higher end isn't quite as good, the lower end isn't nearly as terrible. So if you get the worst case scenario, it's not quite as bad as the worst case scenario from the other banner. But aside from the highest end, like the mid to high end of this banner is still pretty good, which is why I felt comfortable giving it the edge in this arrangement. Number 3. Red Knights 1. This banner leads off with Squirturia, who is one of the craziest single-target archers. She was a looper even before Castoria, and now she's pretty much unstoppable. Having a chance to reduce charge on NP is amazing too. Then comes Ibuki Doji. She's a Vich-compatible Buster Servant, and her raw damage is lower than Artoria's, but she has a nice chunk of utility that makes her excel against defensive enemies. Next up is Ishtar, a Vich-compatible AoE archer. Using her at low NP levels might be a bit precarious, but she's pretty good. Next is Ereshkigal, who's in a pretty similar boat. She's not exactly a damage juggernaut, so you do want NP levels, but that said, she's still pretty good. Sliding down a bit further is Okita Soji, the vanilla version. She's a quick beatstick with solid compatibility with both versions of Scotty, especially Summer Scotty, but in my opinion she has too many one-turn buffs for her own good. As for Brynhildr, she's just a beatstick. She gets some points for having crit, which means she works okay even at low NP levels, but I'd want something with a bit more substance myself. Oh boy, this banner though got its rating tanked by one servant, and that servant is Void Shiki. She is a non-looping AoE saber with insta-kill reliance and no hard protection, and pretty low utility all around. Just a servant in desperate need of some buffs. But overall, the First Knight's banner is a goldmine for anyone interested in using the Koyanskaya Buster looping system later this year. Number 2. Red Extra 1. Topping off this list is Space Ishtar, who's a generalist farmer. She works in multiple card types, so you'd want to use arts first and foremost. That aside though, very flexible, good stuff. Then comes Summer Bibi, who is Vich compatible. She has a card locking utility and a rare class. Very useful, but don't tell her I said that. Then there's Himiko, who is a Buster crit servant, but she has a very dirty trick. You see, she has overcharge on NP, and this gives her degenerate synergy with Castoria to make an early version of the Immortal team. Filthy stuff, though odds are in the future you'll want to use Morgan over Himiko. Next up is Yang Guifei, a single target foreigner. She's burn reliant, which means enemies with debuff immunity are no good, but the fact that she is a single target foreigner in and of itself is highly valuable. Then comes Meltrilus, a single target alter ego. She has very good damage and you only have so many options for this slot. Melt is a candidate for being the best alter ego as it stands, so there you go. Then there's King Protea, who is a weird alter ego. She's got a non-standard playstyle, but she's an individually strong servant. And at the bottom of this banner are the two Abigails. I'm actually kind of surprised this banner did as well as it did, because I was expecting the Abigails to be a millstone around it. But yeah, Vanilla Abby is rough. She leans to a large degree on her foreigner class, and foreigners are quite valuable. Then there's Summer Abigail, who is very rough, but having on paper Vich synergy with a 50% battery stops her from sliding into actual trash tier. It's just a shame she's reliant on a bad sleep mechanic. And at number 1, we have Red Cavalry 1. No surprise here, the upper end of this banner is fucking ridiculous. We obviously have Castoria, who's a meta arts enabler and probably the single best servant you can get from this entire thing. Summer Musashi is an extremely strong generalist arts looper with a fair bit of utility, and being a Zerk means that NP1 usage isn't quite as precarious. Follow that up with Kama, one of the most powerful single target assassins. She's got a 50% battery, anti-alter ego abilities. Really the only slight against her is that she's a quick servant, which means you have to give up Castoria's protection and run with Scotty, at least for optimal usage. Then there's Da Vinci Rider, who's a very efficient arts looper. Does what it says on the box, not much to say there. As for Ilya, I don't really like her kit. It's pretty clunky, but with all her upgrades, she actually has the highest raw NP damage of all casters. And a 50% battery to boot, meaning you can do some Koyanskaya shenanigans. Just remember that she debuffs herself on NP, and her kit has only a 70% chance of giving her debuff immunity once. Mysterious Heroine X is a decent single target beatstick. With all her upgrades, she does a nice chunk of damage. I'd want Kama over her, but she's not bad. Then there's Murasaki. Going from NP1 to 0 means your damage is going to be an issue. She has decent utility, but for a 5-star AoE caster, I think she's a bit too niche. Now the only bad servant on this banner I'd say is Semiramis. She's an extremely outdated and clunky AoE assassin. Her battery is too low to use in the Koyanskaya system, so she doesn't have much of a future. Her only notable utility is buff removal resistance tied to NP. But you know, she has a buster NP and some difficulty charging it, so that only counts for so much. Surprise, surprise, the Castoria banner is number 1. Although I gotta admit, I'm absolutely fucking shocked that the Scotty banner ended up being dead last. How the fuck does that happen? I mean, I guess what that means is that there are a lot of really terrible, like, limited 5-star assassins, really. But yeah, I'm very curious as to what you guys ended up going with, so let me know in the comments down below. As for me, I'll be rolling the GSSRs myself this coming weekend. I stream 3 PM Pacific time, Friday through Sunday, twitch.tv/FinoTyson. Like if you liked the video, subscribe for more, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.